Hello Shivans and welcome back to the podcast that helps you learn a little bit of history. Today I wanted to make a video on Locusta of Gaul because I think she's really interesting and must have been a bit of a legend, but so much of the internet says that she was the first serial killer in history. And I thought, great, awesome achievement for women everywhere. But then I wondered if she actually was, and yeah, it turns out she's the first serial killer in Western history. Still an impressive title though, but today we'll talk about the first serial killers from ancient times to probably slightly more modern, and of course we'll talk about Locusta. I hope that's okay. And if we have any true crime fan listeners over for this episode, because it's like a crime history crossover, hi, welcome. Everyone watching and listening, please do subscribe or follow and give the episode a like. And let's get into some history. In Greek mythology, we have a man called Procrustes, who is the first famous serial killer from pop culture. His legend came from Attica, where he was known as the Stretcher. He had a house on the side of a busy road that would take in travellers, and they could eat and sleep there for the night in a special iron bed. If they were shorter than the bed, he would stretch them to fit. Too long and you lose your legs. Basically, torture that ended in death. Eventually, the hero Theseus comes along and kills Procrustes in his own bed. So while probably not a real man, because it's just a story from mythology, it's still the first story we have of a serial killer, and the Procrustean bed is still used proverbially, meaning violently forcing someone or something into an unnatural scheme or pattern. But I must admit I'd never heard it before or seen it mentioned on like catchphrase, so who knows if it's actually used. So then who's the first real life serial killer in all of history? Liu Pengli, or the Prince of Gedon, a marauder from the 2nd century BCE, which I found out today means like a raider, so to go marauding means to look for things to steal or attack, which I didn't know before, and that makes me kind of sad for the marauders in Harry Potter. Why would they call themselves that? Or maybe it has two meanings, who knows if I'm being thick or not. He'd go out on these raiding expeditions with slaves or men hiding from the law, and he killed over 100 people. It's said that one of the victims of the gang's son eventually reported this to the emperor, and the court said he was condemned to death. But the emperor's not going to do that to his own son, is he? So instead he is just banished from the kingdom and stripped of his titles. So the first serial killer in all of history was a nepotism baby. Who would have guessed? Then we have Queen Anula of Anuradhapura, a Sri Lankan queen from 47 to 41 BCE. She was the first queen of their history to hold so much power. Before that, she was the first woman to be ordained a Buddhist nun, and then later became the first female leader of the state in Asia. So pretty cool if you ask me. But of course, she's not, because otherwise she wouldn't be mentioned in this episode, as she's possibly the first Black Widow of history. First, she married King Choronaga, who she killed with poison in his food, but not before having affairs with the palace guard. Then his son Kuda-Tissa is her second husband. She has affairs with a guard and kills Tissa with poison again, and her guard lover took over, Siva. He's king for a very short time until she poisons him because she's fallen in love with a carpenter, Vatuku. Just please at this point bear in mind that the biggest source we have on her is written by somebody who paints her really badly, so who actually knows what happened? Interestingly though, it comes from the Mahavasama, which is a chronicle of Sri Lankan history in the style of an epic poem. I just think that's quite cool. But yeah, she kills her third husband. So the carpenter becomes king until a year and a bit later, and guess what? She kills him for a wood carrier. Now, I don't know what that is, but he becomes king. She kills him for Nilia, a palace priest, who then becomes king, who she also kills, obviously, and instead of remarrying then, she just takes the power for herself, but only for 4 months, because the second son of Choronaga, that bloke 5 husbands ago, comes in with an army to seize the throne, and she is burned alive in the palace for her crimes. Then comes Locusta, the first serial killer in Western history. So that should be the end of all our firsts, shouldn't it? She lived in Gaul, learning about herbs and their healing properties, but also their dangers, and when she moved to Rome, her knowledge caught the attention of Rome's elite, who loved to use poison as a discreet way of offing their enemies. So she quickly learned that her skills gave her a great amount of power. Her most famous, or rather infamous, poisoning started with Agrippina the Younger, someone I've spoken about before at length, so please check out that video if you want to, or if you care. But she wanted the power of the emperor for her son Nero, so she brings in Locusta. She got rid of Emperor Claudius, Agrippina's husband, by poisoning his food taster, then poisoning the emperor's mushrooms, and then the feather that he kept by his side in case he suspected poison, is how the story goes. So now Nero is emperor, and she's really gained notoriety, if she wasn't known enough already. She poisoned his half-brother Britannicus before that to ensure Nero was emperor and not him. It said that she didn't manage to kill him on the first attempt, so Nero threatened her with execution. So the next night she used a much quicker poison. Apparently Nero didn't care about subtleties. Nero then actually employed her in the palace to ensure he could get rid of anyone he needed to, because having someone who could make untraceable poison was pretty important to this emperor. She was given property and even a school where she would teach other people how to make her deadly poisons. Strange, isn't it? If she was born a few hundred years later, she would have been burned at the stake for being a witch. But at this point, she's used famously by those in charge. But Nero's reign comes to a sticky end, and his successor, Emperor Galba, got rid of all his associated villains, as told by many ancient writers like Cassius Dio, who tells us Helios, Narcissus, Petrobius, Locusta the sorceress, and others of the scum that had come to surface in Nero's day. He ordered them to be led in chains through the whole city, and then to be executed. So, pretty nasty end for a tricky woman. Just FYI, most of these will probably be women murdering their husbands or other people, because I don't want to talk about or research disgusting killers who murder and essay children, like Gilderay or Zuchenatier. I'm sure there's other crime or history creators who have made videos on them if you want to hear about them, but that's just not what I want to talk about or what I'm comfortable having to research. So I'll be sticking to female poisoners or witches for this video. I'm in no way saying the behaviour of these people that I'll talk about isn't disgusting and terrifying. I just mean that this research was based on who was the earliest serial killers and then similar people from mythology or truth, rather than the abhorrent real life ones. I don't know if I'm explaining myself well, and I'm not sure I had to explain it either, but I thought some of you might be annoyed that I've not spoken about, I don't know, Gilderay, or that I'm mostly going to be talking about women, but actually you're all familiar with this channel, so you were probably expecting it and are perfectly fine with it. So if you are, thanks. Let me know I was panicking over nothing. Subscribe, follow the podcast, and let's move on. Another female serial killer who came much later was Alice Kyteler. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's an Irish name. Known as the Kilkenny Witch, she was the first woman to be condemned of witchcraft in Ireland. Her father died in 1298, leaving her to inherit his banking businesses and properties, so she's quite well off. And then she marries one of his former associates, whose brother would go on to be Lord Chancellor of Ireland, so she's living the high life, you'd assume. After they had a son, he died suddenly, and she marries another wealthy banker, who died soon after again, apparently after a drinking spree. She then married a wealthy landlord who suddenly fell ill and died. So she has all of these men's fortunes, and she marries for a fourth time to John Lepore, who starts to notice his health declining and thinks it's the doing of his new wife. So he enlists the help of the friars at St. Francis Abbey, who pass it to the bishop just before John dies. Apparently it had been thought for a while that Alice was practicing witchcraft, and after having extended her home into an inn that attracted all the wealthy men to visit, she was known for being able to manipulate men quite easily, and these wealthy men into giving her lavish gifts. The inn still exists today, which I think is very cool and would be very interesting to see. But the bishop charged Alice and her supposed coven of being witches for using sorcery, consulting demons, and of course, heresy. But we know she has friends in high places. And when the bishop wrote to the Lord Chancellor to arrest Alice, he was denied and instead arrested himself as she fled to Dublin. But sadly for Alice, the Lord Chief Justice released the bishop and found the inquisition into the case to be correct, and had Alice and her coven arrested. But she fled Dublin for England and disappears from history. So her very unfortunate servant was burned at the stake in her place. Maybe she was like Locusta and she used poisons to kill off all her husbands for their fortunes. But if she was an evil witch, why would the brother of the first husband support her and say that the bishop couldn't arrest her? Well, I suppose the argument is that she's a very good manipulator, isn't she? She's very persuasive. So who knows? Well, we all know. None of those women accused of witchcraft were actually witches. There's two that I do want to talk about that are slightly different. They're a bit more mythological. Folktale, I mean. The werewolf of Bedburg, or Peter Stumpp, is a phenomenon that came during the werewolf hysteria of 16th century Europe. Now, he reportedly murdered and ate 14 children among women, pregnant women, and animals. And I know I said I didn't want to talk about children, but this one's interesting because of the supernatural elements. He also murdered and ate his own son and had disgusting relations with his daughter. But he was proud of his crimes and claimed that the devil had given him a magic belt that allowed him to transform into the likeness of a greedy, strong, and devouring wolf. Interesting delusional claim, isn't it? It said he ate women and children while in the form of a werewolf, as well as other animals. Him and his daughter's execution on the 31st of October 1589 is said to have been one of the most brutal in history, with his head being put on a pole with a werewolf figure on top to deter any similar behaviour, as if anyone else was going to do that. And then we have Iceland's only serial killer, Axlar Bjorn, or Bjorn, but I think it's Bjorn, like ABBA. He was executed in 1596 after murdering at least 18 people. His story comes from a tale of Icelandic folk and fairy tales, but folklore stories have to originate somewhere, right? Some say he's real and has been intertwined with myth. His mother had a desire to drink blood while pregnant with him, so her husband would give her his, but then she started having nightmares and said that her child would be a monster. And well, he was. It's said that at 15 years old he had a strange dream where a man gave him a plate of meat cut into pieces. He ate 18 pieces, but by the 19th began to feel sick and stopped. He couldn't finish. Then the man said there's an object in the mountain that would make him famous. So he wakes up and finds an axe. It's implied the dream must have been human meat. As he begins murdering, people notice that weirdly the number of horses he has is multiplying, and he's starting to wear clothes that are oddly familiar to them. But one day, in an attempt to kill a little boy, he fails. He must have been number 19, who escaped and brings justice to him. And he was then torn limb from limb. Now, similar to Alice Kyteler, when women in history had some sort of power, or were maybe a part of the aristocracy, without the need of a man, they built up this reputation of being power-hungry, crazed women, often witches or torturers. Catalina de los Rios y la Spurga, or La Quintrala, from Chile, was so named because of her flaming red hair. Apparently, she's one of the earliest documented female serial killers, and her name is still synonymous with cruelty and abuse. But again, I've not heard it used before. Let me know if you have. It's possible it was a family trait, as in 1601 her mother and aunt, Catalina and Maria, attempted to poison the governor. Maria was charged with murder and exiled to Peru, and I'm not entirely sure how her mother got away with it. Her mother then married the heir and secretly killed his daughter and someone who discovered her poisoning of the governor. So then our Catalina murders her father in 1622, apparently by poisoning his food, despite the fact that her grandmother arranged her marriage to try to control her cruel nature. It doesn't seem that she hated the man, or well, she doesn't kill him. But slowly her murderous tendencies were uncovered. An affair, a night, torturing slaves, that kind of thing. By 1634 there was an inquest, where her ridiculous number of cruelties were revealed. Tortures, bribes, murders. But because of her huge wealth and status and influence, she was released. She was one of the cruelest murderesses from history, who died free of punishment just in her home in 1665. Women like her, and those who will follow, suggest that some have an inherent urge to kill, cold-blooded and deadly in completely unwarranted ways. It's like it's just in their nature. One, similar to Catalina, was Elizabeth Bathory of Hungary, who you've probably heard of as the Blood Countess. The Blood Countess is said to have killed and tortured 650 young women from 1585 to 1610. But I did a whole video on her last Halloween, or the Halloween before, so I don't need to tell you it all again, do I? As a noblewoman, she grew up in Exed Castle, and then she married a baron who gifted her his home, Czet Castle. I don't even know how to attempt to pronounce that. Csejte. But then he died after leading troops in a war against the Ottomans, so she ran the estate. The first accounts of her killing spree don't appear until 1729, which is more than a century after she died. So accuracy is questionable. The Tragica Historia told us of Elizabeth as a vampire-like creature, bringing peasant girls to work for her in the castle, but then torturing and killing them through various gruesome methods, and then bathing in their blood to restore her youth. The OG inspiration for Dracula, some say, but that's a whole other argument in itself. Apparently, she kept a diary of all her victims, which is where the number 650 came from, but no one knows where that diary is, so I don't know how much I believe that story. And actually, it'd be interesting to hear what I said 2 years ago, because I may well have believed it then. Darya Saltykovia from Imperial Russia was a noblewoman who would torture and murder her servants. She got away with things for a while before the relatives of her victims brought an official petition to Catherine the Great, who had her chained to a public platform for an hour with a sign that said, "This woman tortured and murdered." Doesn't seem like that much of a punishment. Fortunately, though, the public humiliation wasn't her only punishment. She was to be imprisoned for life. For the first 11 years, she was held in the basement of a convent with no light, no windows, no people. And then she was moved to another cell that did have windows, where she would spit at spectators and poke them with sticks. And she had clearly lost her mind, which makes sense. But that lasted 22 years before she died in 1801, so quite a long time in prison. Madame LeBlanque, or Marie Delphine McCarthy, or Delphine Lalaurie, would torture and murder slaves in her house. Quite a similar story so far, but she was on her third marriage. Both men had previously died, when in 1834 there was a fire in her mansion on Royal Street in the French quarters of New Orleans. Slaves were discovered in the attic bound, with evidence of cruel abuse for years and just horrific violence. So her house was ransacked by a furious mob, and she unfortunately escaped to France. Now, as I said, it seems these women were all aristocrats, but I suppose that's all that really gets recorded in history anyway. No one cares about the poor enough to tell their tales. So there may well have been other killers. In fact, there must have been. And the first serial killer of history, I would argue, cannot be the Prince of Zhejiang from the 2nd century. There is no way there was no serial killer before then. You're telling me it took thousands of years of humans before the first mass murderer? As lovely as that would be, I don't believe it. It's strange to think about, really. And so, there you go. A very brief history of the first recorded serial killers in history, and some bonus female killers and folktale murderers. I do hope you enjoyed, even if this felt like a bit of a random episode to do, but nevertheless, there we go. If you're watching, please do subscribe and like the video, and if you're listening, please do follow the podcast and download it to listen on the go. And with that, I'll see you next time. Bye bye.